Hello, I'm Xiomy Hernandez, and I'm interviewing Chip Storey. Chip is a co-founder and principal of Normal Next. You have training as an attorney, you have experience as an administrator, and you volunteer a lot with the Jacksonville Historical Society and also the St. Augustine Historical Society.
Yes, that is true, yes.
Where your versatile skills are used to help interpret and preserve and spread the word about the rich cultural history surrounding these areas. Today's date is June 15th, 2022. We're at the Lincolnville Museum in St. Augustine, Florida. Chip, can you please say and spell your name for me, please?
I'm sorry, can I tell you?
Say and spell your name for me.
My name, all right. I am Charles Storey, S-T-O-R-E-Y. Most people call me Chip, like potato chip. I think you wanted to know when I was born, and I was born when Kennedy was president, put it that way. That gives you the right ballpark, without getting too specific.
Could you tell me where you were born?
I was born in San Diego, California.
Okay.
I did not grow up in San Diego. I grew up outside Cleveland, Ohio. And then in high school, I went to a boarding school in New Hampshire. And then went to college in Massachusetts. And then in law school in California. Worked in California for many years. Then worked in DC for even more years. Then worked in Boston for many years. And then moved to St. Augustine, where my family had been coming for 30 years. My parents bought a place here as snowbirds, and they used to fly down seasonally in the Cleveland winters, and then as they got to be more frail, they decided to make this their home permanently, and I am now here helping them.
Great. Could you tell me about your parents, where they were born and maybe what they did?
Sure. My parents were born in the 1930s. My mother was born in New York City, and my father was born in Tuskegee, Alabama. He grew up in Cleveland, though. I mean, his parents moved to Cleveland when he was an infant, so he's primarily a Clevelander. And my parents met at university and married. My dad was a year ahead of my mother. They married the year my mother graduated, and 2 years later moved to California, and that's when I was born.
Do you have any siblings?
One brother and one sister. A brother who lives in Paris, who's younger, and then a sister who's still younger, who lives in Cleveland, Ohio.
That's great. Can you tell me about your educational background? It can be either early or maybe about college.
Can I ask you to speak a little louder? Just,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you, but just as a general old age.
No problem.
I went to boarding school, as I said. That was Phillips Exeter Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire. I went to Harvard University as an undergraduate, where I studied the history and literature of Latin America, which sort of feeds my interest in Fort Mosaic and St. Augustine, and we can talk about that. I went to Stanford University for law school, and again, focused heavily on Latin America while in law school. And I don't know if you want to count this as part of my education or not, but I also had a fellowship from the European Commission to study vocational training and education and international training programs. At the time, I was heavily involved in higher education, and this was a fellowship tied to some of my work. So I got to go to Belgium and Germany to study these things.
So do you know any other languages? You've been to so many places.
Sure. Because of the emphasis on Latin America, I have been pretty fluent in Spanish, and I'm fluent in Portuguese. I would say I am conversant but not fluent in Italian. And because of family connection, my brother, as I mentioned, is in France. And for many years, my parents had an apartment in Paris to be near my brother's family. And my two nephews who have grown up in France, the result being that the family spent a lot of time there. And so I can fake French. I won't make great claims to it, but I can get by. So.
All right. Have you always had an interest in history?
Yeah, that's a family interest. My mother's first career was actually as a history teacher. And shortly, my family moved from California to Cleveland, and my dad was in law school in Cleveland, and my mother was a history teacher in major works, which is sort of the advanced or the honors program in the Cleveland public schools. And so she taught history to college-bound kids. But even outside of that, it was something we talked about often at home. And my father right now is working on a book, a history text, not a text, a historical study. My mother wrote a book on African American history when I was in elementary school. So history in general is a big deal with us. There even were arguments at the table dinner over historical things. So, I guess that makes us oddballs, but it happened. What can I tell you?
And so your interest in, your passion for history, this led to, your work in historical societies and like that?
Yes, my passion for history, and more specifically, my passion for this area. St. Augustine, and by extension, northeastern Florida, have been crossroads for so much of what constitutes the American population. And it's not studied nearly as much by people outside the region as it should be. I think the great history texts and the history narratives have been shaped by people largely in New England. And the fascinating interplay here between the French and the English and the Spanish, the indigenous populations, and the degree to which so much of the history of northeastern Florida was also a battle between Anglo anxiety over, well, Spanish presence, but also the presence of freed Africans. Freed Africans who actually had access to guns and things that terrified the English settlers in Georgia and the Carolinas and further north. All of that, and how that fear led to English invasion of Florida, and how the people who came to be called Seminoles and blacks worked often with the Spanish, sometimes against other Seminoles in battles between the English colonies and the Spanish colonies. It was fascinating, and it feeds into the whole history of Florida. People being pushed by Andrew Jackson into the inner parts of the state, and the Seminole Wars, and all those things. So it's a long answer, but yes.
All right. Could you tell me a little bit about your role as a member of the Jacksonville Historical Society?
I'm a director. I'm on the board of directors of the Jacksonville Historical Society. And my involvement there stems in part from the fact that there's a consulting firm of which I'm a principal, with originally 4 other principals, now 3 other principals. We are doing a project for the Jacksonville Historical Society, helping them visualize and bring into fruition a museum of Jacksonville area music. Music that is classical, music that is Southern rock, music that is faith-inspired, R&B, soul, hip-hop. The point is to showcase Jacksonville. And because of this involvement, I was asked to join the board of the Historical Society, because this is an Historical Society project and it's a high-profile one. And our firm, along with another board members organization, have been very involved in the effort. And I have an appetite for history. So.
Can I ask about the task force of the Music History Museum? Are you part of it?
Yes, we are. Okay, one of the things that my firm has done is that we have been conducting oral histories of individuals in the history of music in Jacksonville. So we have been speaking to roadies and to retired musicians, some musicians who are still performing. And people don't even think of in the industry, caterers to rock events and promoters to rock events, DJs, people who own record stores, members of the Jacksonville Symphony Orchestra, a couple people who are involved in Christian rock. I mean, a whole lot of things that we've done. We've also put together, along with some historical experts in Jacksonville, possible historical tours of the city, self-guided tours that visitors can take that will take them to landmarks in the city's musical history, whether it's a bordello where certain musicians may have played, whether it's the Armory where Janis Joplin performed. Sibelius's home is a classical musician who lived in Jacksonville. Stores run by guitar makers and violin makers, that sort of thing. And we've even helped identify software packages that can be used to help people on these self-guided tours.
That's very cool. Can you tell me about an oral history interview that you did that stood out to you?
One that was?
An oral history, like you said you conducted oral histories.
Yes.
Can you tell me about one that was maybe memorable to you or stood out?
Okay, well, there have been a few that are memorable. We recently conducted an oral history interview, someone named Sidney Drashin, and he was a major figure in the history of promoting rock music in Northeast Florida, throughout the Southeast. And he's the man who brought the Rolling Stones to Florida for the first time. And he has all kinds of paraphernalia and articles that talked about that experience. We also interviewed in France, remotely, somebody named John Betch, who's a jazz drummer. And what's interesting about John Betch, in addition to his musical history, is that his great-grandfather, Abraham Lincoln Lewis, was the first black millionaire in Florida. And he started the Afro-American Insurance Company with some other individuals. And that company prospered. It was based in Jacksonville. And another thing that this gentleman did is that he purchased a lot of land in what is now Amelia Island. And at a time when Jim Crow kept a lot of Florida segregated, they created American Beach, which was a black resort where families could come and hang out on the beach. And there were beach houses and cabarets and all sorts of things. And it was a piece of what I think some of the people that we've talked to call a piece of paradise in a time when many people couldn't go to the beach at all because the Florida law said no. And in fact, another set of interviews that we did had to do with a place called the Rendezvous, which was a jazz club in American Beach, where Cab Calloway and other big names in jazz performed. Oftentimes they would play someplace in downtown Jacksonville and then come to American Beach and perform at the Rendezvous. And the Rendezvous was a huge institution at American Beach and in Jacksonville's black community. And so we ended up speaking to John Betch, who's tied to that history, but also to his sister and the president of the American Beach Museum, and another gentleman, to talk about the history of the Rendezvous and American Beach. So that was also pretty interesting. There's people like Longino Parsons, who is a professor at the Florida A&M and a major figure in jazz. And Marcus Roberts, who's a pretty well-known jazz pianist. And Marcus Roberts actually studied in St. Augustine at the St. Augustine School for the Deaf and Blind, as did Ray Charles. So there's that interesting St. Augustine, African American, Jacksonville music history, all tied into one.
That's very cool.
One more. I mean, again, tell me if I'm blabbing, but I want to make sure that you get this information. This is an interview I did not conduct, but one of our associates did, because we've been encouraging the associates to conduct some interviews. And he interviewed the bodyguard for the band Leonard Skinner. I mean, I don't know, I mean, you're kind of young, you may or may not know Leonard Skinner, but huge, hugely popular Southern rock band in the 80s, and from Jacksonville. And they died, many of them, the original members, in a plane crash. Well, this bodyguard was on that plane, and he survived.
Wow.
And so we were able to talk to him about his experience as a bodyguard, his history with the Van Zandt brothers, who were instrumental in starting Leonard Skinner, and the horrors of that accident and what it has meant for his life subsequently. So that would be another particularly noteworthy interview. We interviewed somebody who makes violins and guitars, a luthier in Jacksonville, who's from Spain. And it was interesting to get his history and why he chose to come to the United States, why he chose to be particularly in Jacksonville. And then it turns out that his father or his grandfather, was a mailman to Salvador Dali, the famous Spanish painter. And because of that relationship, his family actually ended up acquiring a Dali painting. People have fascinating stories. So I'll let you ask more questions.
All right, thank you. It's great to hear you be so passionate about oral histories and about what you do. It comes out a lot,
You know what? The connection to oral history also, it's the passion for history, but it's also that for many years, of the time in Washington specifically, I was the head of a consulting practice that focused on higher education. And very often that work required us to venture to different parts of the country on behalf of clients, and we had to collect information. And often we collected information through structured interviews and focus groups. So this work came before my involvement with oral history per se, but it's a lot of the same idea. And I did this for 20 years, not 20 years, 15 years. I also did for 5 years, was an officer at a federal agency where I had to conduct site visits to people that we had made grants to. And again, there was a very structured interview format to get information. And so that I can go back and say, yes, for 20 years, I was doing this in a different capacity. And switching over to oral history was actually even more fun, because now I was focusing on history per se and not necessarily on problem solving.
So if you don't mind me asking more about the Jacksonville Historical Society, do you feel comfortable telling me about any challenges you encountered while there?
Okay. The Historical Society is very excited about establishing this music museum, in part because it will showcase something that Jacksonville is famous for. There are, however, traditionalists who say, what does that have to do with history? And sometimes it takes convincing them that this is part of the town's historical patrimony. Sometimes what you're actually reacting to is a distaste they may have for the people who made music. Some people love Southern rock, but other traditionalists might say those are long hairs. Those not long hairs in the classical music sense, but hippies, druggy. They degrade American culture as opposed to contributing to it. So sometimes you have to navigate that tension on the board. More recently, and this is something that communities throughout the Southeast have to deal with, there's the question of how does one remember the Confederacy? And what does one do with monuments to the Confederacy? And if a monument stays, how do you contextualize it in a way that doesn't start another civil war? And so that has come up with the Historical Society, as it also came up with the Historical Society in St. Augustine, and has in other places where there are monuments to the Confederate States of America, and there are people who, with legitimate reason, find that appalling. Whereas others will say, it's my history. How dare you tell my history appalling? I have a story in this regard. And again, if I'm rambling.
No, feel free.
I mentioned that my brother lives in France, and my nephews grew up in Paris, went to an international school. But they come to St. Augustine every summer to visit. And one time they were here, and we were walking through the plaza in St. Augustine, and I showed them, because it was still standing at that point, the Confederate monument. And one of them said out loud, "Why would you memorialize that?" And there was someone else walking by who heard him say that and said, "Don't you be bad-mouthing my ancestors." And so right there is a teachable moment, because the boys were seeing how an historical event, an historical monument can provoke different reactions. Abhorrence, because these two are black, and they have been taught about the US Civil War from an outsider European perspective, which was somewhat critical. And then here's somebody whose family had grown up in the South for many generations, and this was, from this person's perspective, the lost cause. You can get history lessons on the street.
Can I ask, how has the Jacksonville Historical Society impacted other areas of your life?
The Jacksonville Historical Society, not Fort Mosaic or the other ones.
You can answer whichever one you'd like.
Okay, well, the Jacksonville Historical Society has got me interested, in the broader history of Northeast Florida beyond St. Augustine. For years, when we came here from elsewhere, we went from the airport to St. Augustine. I had never been to Jacksonville at all. It just was not on my radar. It was someplace different, which is perhaps unusual if you're not from here, that St. Augustine and Jacksonville are so close and yet different universes. And as a result of my involvement with the Historical Society, I am learning about the city of Jacksonville, its histories, its neighborhoods, and meeting other people who are historically and culturally invested in the community. And that has been good. The involvement with St. Augustine Historical Society and with Fort Mose has been even more personal. St. Augustine Historical Society, I have been able to look at old documents from the Spanish colonial period. And again, because I have an interest in Latin American history and speak Spanish, I can look at these documents and draw information out of them and learn more about the community of St. Augustine, and in the process be of assistance, or so I hope, to the Historical Society. Fort Mose Historical Society, even more so. I mean, until I started working with them on their board, I really didn't fully understand the significance and the importance of Fort Mose. I sort of vaguely knew that it had been a community. Their runaway enslaved people had gone. But the whole notion of the southward Underground Railroad, as opposed to the one heading to Canada, was really remarkable. And the fact that the Spanish even though they were doing so for instrumental reasons, not necessarily humanitarian ones, recognized this community, gave people freedom. And I've been a docent there at the museum, Fort Mose, and someone said, well, were they really free? They had to be soldiers. I mean, no, they just weren't picking things. They were protecting Spanish. And I pointed out, yeah, well, think about the women, who by and large were not carrying guns. The women were free to farm, and they were raising their children who were not enslaved. They were not picking on someone else's behalf. They were not someone's forced concubine or forced wet nurse. This was a much better existence for them. And the other thing to remember is that, sure, these gentlemen had to be soldiers, but the Spanish gave them guns. The whole reason that the English were worried about this community was that Spain was arming former slaves. It was very frightening to the English. And it says something about, it may have been Spanish desperation because you need more soldiers, but at the end of the day, they armed the people that the English were afraid to arm. And they fought with them. And when the English got Florida, and later when the Americans got Florida, the Spanish didn't abandon these people, but allowed them to go, if they wanted, to Cuba, where, yes, their life was hard. But they went to Cuba as free people. They were not rounded up and given back to their English owners. So, yes, Fort Mose still entailed a kind of indenture for males for being soldiers. But people voted with their feet. Okay, I mean, that's the bottom line.
Great answer. I think you answered about like 3 of my questions I had written down just with that.
Well, see, we blabbermouths tend to do that, you know?
So can I ask about what are your thoughts on Fort Mose's representation at the moment? Do you think most people understand the importance of this site?
Most people don't know it. There was the University of Florida, along with the St. Augustine Historical Society, sponsored the first annual History Week just last month for St. Augustine. And I mean, on the one hand, St. Augustine is always celebrating history, but this was a special event asking different communities in, different institutions, not communities, institutions in St. Augustine to create an event that would bring locals to their particular institution and get folks interested in the city's history through these particular institutions. And Fort Mose had some events, and interestingly, there were a lot of people from St. Augustine and Jacksonville who came, who had never been there and didn't know anything about the history at all. And they very much appreciated the video and the museum and the docent tour. They liked that because this is something that's not really well covered in discussing American history, and it needs to be elevated. I mean, that's what the Fort Mose Historical Society is trying to do, is raise consciousness and visibility for this extraordinary historical event or historical phenomenon, this first free community of African descendants in the continental United States. So they need to do more. The Historical Society and the State Park recently sponsored a jazz series for the first time. It was 6, it ended up being 5 concerts, and they're going to do it each year. which brings all kinds of people to the space that is Fort Mose, and in its own oblique way tells the story, because people go there, they say, well, why is this happening? Well, it's happening because it's Fort Mose. Oh, also, the jazz concert, along with a recent grant received by the park, is funding the building of a replica of the first fort. And that will probably increase foot traffic to the site of Fort Mose and will help tell the story, and will get more publicity. At a recent board meeting, Elizabeth, and I don't know her last name,
Ibarrola.
okay, who is leading your summer experience, presented some of the findings that your team of archaeologists has discovered. And people in the room were blown away. I mean, that this late in the game, there still are things to be found in the swamps and in the dirt on the site. Publicizing this, which I hope you will do when we ask you to next year, makes a big difference. Publicizing that you found it, publicizing who you are, who found it, all is very good for building the story of Fort Mose.
Thank you. Thank
Sure.
you for that. So I know you already explained this a little bit, but how would you explain to someone who maybe doesn't know about Fort Mose how the historical societies play a role in the preservation and interpretation of Fort Mose?
Sure. Well, I can't remember exactly when, I don't know, the private lands upon which this site became a state park. But the existence of the state park, the Fort Mose Historic State Park, already sets aside the property for people to enjoy recreationally. The Historical Society, in tandem with the park, has made efforts to make sure that the park is not just a place to picnic, but is also a place to reflect upon what actually happened there. And part of this is the visitor center with the museum, and then the films, even the swag helps. I mean, there are mugs and T-shirts, and more recently, a set of historical posters about Fort Mose that help people take the story with them when they leave. And this has been part of the efforts of the Historical Society. The Historical Society also has reenactments of the Battle of Bloody Mose, when the English under Oglethorpe come down from Georgia and are trying to take over the community. And St. Augustine, the Spanish soldiers, as well as the African American soldiers, get together and repel the English. And you get to see this reenacted. And more recently, the Historical Society has sponsored something called Flight to Freedom, whereby visitors to the site learn, through speaking to people in period costume, what roles different populations played in having formerly enslaved people get here. So you end up meeting an individual who's deciding to run away. You end up meeting slave catchers, people who are getting a bounty on whatever they can catch. You end up meeting friendly bodies along the way. Yamasee Indians who are encouraging people and leading them southward. Boatmen, people who are on either the St. Johns River or along the inlet and the Atlantic, who are helping people in the boats head south. Then the actual people in the community of Fort Mose who greet the newly arrivals and help them acclimate. So you have this, and there's going to be, there isn't yet, but there's a trail that does exist. And there are going to be interpretive panels along this trail so that people who don't happen to be here on the days where the people in period costume are telling this story can still see the story in the panels. Maybe you have already seen, but there are panels in the walkway to the visitor center that also tell the story of being brought here from Africa and the interactions with the Yamasees and the differences between how the Spanish legal system treated slaves and how the British legal system did, which was important, I'll tell you, as a Latin American history geek. Bloody Mose. I mean, all of these things are helping tell the story. There's also been a TV special many years ago where people from the Historical Society were interviewed, and this is for PBS. But this ongoing mission, or a calling, really, to make the world know about Fort Mose is what the Historical Society does. And it's what I find exciting. So that's part of why I'm involved. Again, it has to do with the African American history, but it's also, in my particular interest, the Latin American history. The whole phenomenon of the Spanish creating on the boundaries of their colonies these military communities of former slaves is something that transcends just the United States. It's a whole phenomenon in the Americas, and not entirely the same thing, but somewhat similar. In Brazil and in a lot of Central America and the Caribbean, you had communities of runaways that weren't even recognized by the European powers. They're called quilombo in Brazil and palenque in a lot of the Spanish-speaking world. And these are communities of escaped runaway enslaved folks where they reestablished their own community and their own cultures. There's a famous one in Brazil called Palmares, which maintained its independence from the Portuguese crown for close, I think 80 years. It was finally defeated. But there's a movie about it, Quilombo, Quilombo. And the name Palmares, the name of that Quilombo, is used in many civil rights organizations in Brazil because it speaks to the search for freedom and self-determination. And that, even under the auspices of the Spanish, was part of what Fort Mose was, because Francisco Hernandez was the boss. There was a degree of self-determination that certainly enslaved folks didn't have.
What are your hopes for the Fort Mose Visitor Center and Museum as it grows?
What are the hopes?
What are your hopes?
That the materials that you guys discovered end up in the museum. That perhaps with more such discovery, the museum can grow to be a little larger. that the museum can play a role along with the state park in helping interpret the fort. This is a far-reaching thing, and this is me talking. There's not been any discussion of this. But I would actually be very excited if the Fort Mose Historical Society and Museum were to establish stronger and greater connections to the international community of such institutions, such sites. You know, there could be a whole network of communities that were where escaped enslaved people went, that could work together to elevate this whole notion of what was the experience in this hemisphere, of the experience of the Africans and also some of the indigenous people, that it's not just a matter of being enslaved, that there were, in addition to slave revolts, there were these efforts at self-determination. And this is important. We're talking about human beings, not just chattel. And this is a human victory.
It is, it really is. Can I ask you about, what do you think about the site being made a UNESCO designated site in 2019?
It's great news. It could be, right now, as I understand, there are gradations of what UNESCO recognizes. And so I think the highest gradation is a historic preservation site. And I don't know how it is that Fort Mose got, and it's commendable that they got the recognition. I'm wondering if there are other international recognitions, either through UNESCO and other places, that the site could get. All of this helping to tell the story and just make people aware. I mean, this isn't minor. This is a major part of the human drama and of the settling of this hemisphere and the development of this hemisphere. Development of the state of Florida, you know? Yeah. But for this, there were always going to be people running away from enslavement and coming to Florida if the Spanish didn't catch them. But this institution and the Spanish sort of high-profile treatment of enslaved people as something different from the way the British did it gave the Americans even more incentive than they had. Come into Florida, try to take control of it, capture these people, remove the Indians, and the wars that ensued. It's all tied to this.
Can you tell me about your hopes about the Jacksonville Music Museum that you were talking about?
Oh, my hopes, my hopes, my hopes, my hopes. The museum has a building. It's a casket factory that is being reconfigured. And we are hoping that the museum, in addition to showcasing the particular history of Jacksonville and its music, will also be a site where music will not just be something that you look at through the rearview mirror, but it is also going to be, the museum will be an ongoing place to showcase new music. And so they're hoping there will be a performance space. We talked to the Museum of Jazz in New Orleans, and they have a concert on their facility every day of the year. Why? Because they don't want people to think of music and jazz as just something long ago. Bring in young acts, local acts, national touring acts to let people know that music is a live thing. And so we're hoping that the museum will do that. Keep music alive, appreciation for the past, but also enjoy it now. And bring in that high school choir. And then the next day, bring in Marcus Roberts or some jazz luminary. And then the next day, bring in a group that's involved with Christian rock, so that you're covering all kinds of bases. The other thing, and this is a subtext to this museum, but it's important. You're talking about Jacksonville, a city that is the largest in the country in area, larger than LA. It sprawls. It came to be this large only 50 some years ago. And when it basically became coterminous with Duval County. And in that process, lots of communities that did not really identify with each other became Jacksonville. So part of the goal of this museum and other museums in Jacksonville is to generate pride in the city as part of the city's history. This happens to be Jacksonville's bicentennial year. And so there are a lot of activities going on right now. And it's all trying to build a higher consciousness of Jacksonville as one community. The Historical Society has a slogan, one community, one city, many stories. And that's what the museum project and other Historical Society oral history projects are trying to help build. And then there's another subtext. Jacksonville, like many southern cities, has a deep history of Jim Crow. And as a result of that deep history of Jim Crow, there is Black Jacksonville and there's White Jacksonville. And even within Black Jacksonville, there's this Black community in Jacksonville versus that community in Black Jacksonville, and this community in White Jacksonville, and that community in White Jacksonville. The museum, in showcasing many forms of music, things that sort of transcend these social boundaries, is hoping to bring people under the same roof who would not necessarily do so. Anyone who is conversant in, say, the history of the Almond Brothers, or in the history of the evolution of rock and roll, will tell you about the role that first the blues, and then ragtime and jazz played in terms of introducing new rhythms to music. These forms of music, whether it's ragtime with piano, whether it's using the trumpet or the saxophone to recreate modalities that were popular in the African American community, is in and of itself a fusion of the African and the European. Okay? The music, the tones, the rhythm, that may be what people from Africa brought. The instruments are what the Europeans imposed or made available. So right there, you've got an American phenomenon that speaks to lots of different backgrounds. Then you go from that music, and let's say you talk about to the Almond Brothers, for instance. They matter-of-factly will tell you they, as a white Jacksonvillian band at the time, cultivated sounds and things that they heard from African American R&B groups. And in fact, their house in Jacksonville has a placard in front of it, which talks about a jam session that they had where they were performing with African American musicians, which wasn't always easy, it wasn't always done, but it was in some ways a big emergence of that particular group. And so if you start talking about music as a river with lots of tributaries, it's focusing on the river and its tributaries is a way to make a shared Jacksonvillian identity and pride that hopefully will transcend the balkanization that is historically what Jacksonville has experienced for any number of reasons.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to share?
Thank you. My apologies for rambling.
No, it was great. It was all great.
I hope that you make me look about 20 years younger and 3,000 pounds less heavy. Then I'll be much appreciative. And good luck with all of your work, this project and everything that you're doing, and your professional trajectories after this. All right?
All right. Thank you.
That is.